All right. We should now be live on LinkedIn, YouTube, as well as Twitch. Hello, all of our live friends. And of course, here in Discord. Hello, Discord. Okay, so we're going to get started in just a second. This is the interview with Nicholas Gurley. And it is a shift in strategy. Why an indie video game producer is starting by publishing a board game. For anybody who is unaware of our podcast, here's how this goes. We're going to start this sort of formal recording, the thing that gets uploaded as a podcast, in a minute or two. For everyone who's here live, the way that this works is it's going to be about a 45-minute podcast episode. For the first 20 to 25 minutes, me and Nick will talk one-on-one. That's a chance to hear his story, as well as ask some introductory questions about his areas of expertise, kind of get the conversation going. In the second half of each episode, we ask the guest of honor questions live. So if you have questions for Nick as we go, here's what you do. You drop them in the chat like this. And then you mark them with a Q emoji. And then if you like that question, if you think it's a great question and you want it answered, hit that Q emoji again for me. And that way we can see it's a very popular question. Nick, you can ignore questions for the most part. And I will explicitly call them out when we get there. Okay. When you do ask a question, by the way, do me a favor and tell me if you have a mic and if you want to come up on stage, because I can read the questions for you if you would like, or we can actually bring you up on stage. All right, Nick, I'm going to ask you I'm going to do the introduction, and I'm going to ask you what you're having for lunch. That's your cue that the intro has finished. All right?
Great.
All right, any questions?
None for me.
Okay, let's get the bot in here. And the soundboard. I'm pretty sure that the recording bot doesn't need to be on stage, but I don't trust it. So I do it anyway. There's Craig. And here's our soundboard. All right, we're ready to go. We're now actually recording. Let's do this thing. Welcome, game dev adventures, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today we're talking with Nicholas Gurley about a shift in strategy, why an indie video game producer is starting by releasing a board game.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
Indeed, Salem. Vibes. All right, welcome everybody to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. In our live magical podcast, we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. As always, I'm your host, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster here at the Indie Game Academy and the self-proclaimed Wizard of Joy. And this is a mostly unedited recording of a live event we host in our Discord. We'd love to have you swing by for the next one and ask your own questions. There are links to join down below, and it's every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, joining me on the show today is Nicholas Gurley. Nicholas is the executive producer and founder at C Stories LLC, who are creating Void Pilot's Legacy, but he is also a graduate here at the Indie Game Academy and now has been hired onto our core team as our chief wizard of operations. Welcome, Nick, to the show. What are you having for lunch here today?
Wow. Well, first of all, I had a delicious veggie enchilada, so I'm super excited about that.
Beautiful. So far, I have had coffee.
So that actually is delicious as well.
It is delicious. I do the intermittent fasting, so don't eat until usually noontime. And for a while it sucked, but now coffee is my blood is beautiful. I wake up and I just drink coffee and it feels great.
I feel like every game developer has coffee in our blood. Otherwise, I don't know how we would do any work.
Impossible. Well, impossible. It's so awesome to be interviewing Nick. So me and Nick work with each other, obviously, intimately, with him being the chief of ops here. He is helping us get our shit organized. Thank you for that, Nick.
Welcome.
Absolutely. But we don't get a chance often to talk about what you do, Nick, and what you're building on the side. And we have this kind of interesting topic for today. So you are a game producer, but as the topic suggests, a shift in strategy, why an indie video game producer is starting by producing a board game. You decided not to go with a video game, but instead to get into the physical world. So tell us a little bit about that decision to start things off.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, let me start by telling you like how we actually formed C Stories Creative Studios. And I think that'll kind of lead into the longer question. basically I formed it in August of 2023, which is right before I took the IGA level 3 class, which by the way I took because I wanted to make sure I actually could run a studio, and I definitely learned how to do it. So just from a happy customer, it was exactly what I needed to ensure that I had the confidence to move forward with the studio. Initially, my idea was actually to create multiple small casual games under that title. But then my brother came to me. He's a game developer for board games, and he told me he was going to create a board game he'd been working on for about a year, and then he was going to publish it. And so I was actually helping him start his own company with all the business administration and legal requirements. But then we realized that I already had a company, and his game was actually really fun. And so we made the executive decision together to just combine forces, by our powers combined. And then we shifted Sea Stories from being a single owner to a partnership. And now I'm the executive producer and he is the creative director. And if you haven't read Up, Down, Up by Kim Nordstrom, that does an excellent explanation of like how we work together. Basically, there's lots of friction. I tell him there's too much scope, and he tells me he wants to add more.
Very, very classic design publisher relationship. I love it.
Yeah, and so
yeah.
So the original question you had asked me was, how do we end up deciding to go for board games? So besides starting it that way, there's like a whole mindset shift that kind of came with it, and I can go into that a little bit later in the podcast. But yeah, I'll definitely talk about it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really interesting. Actually, I didn't even know that your brother, for instance, was a board game developer. It's definitely a sister to video game development. And when we talk about the gaming industry, when we track stats for the gaming industry, when we say the gaming industry is worth X amount of dollars, that includes board games. Board games are considered a sort of subcategory of gaming. So it's, despite the fact that it is a sister to video games, it is also, and I can speak from firsthand experience, such a different ballgame. It is an incredibly challenging thing to release a board game. So major respect. Now, I've jumped ahead a little bit this episode, so I want to make sure we get a chance to hear your origin stories, Nick. Tell us how you got to where you are today, and give us the story.
Yeah, sure. Actually, my path is pretty unorthodox. I actually had an entire prior career before I came to the game industry. I had a lot of leadership and a lot of project management experience. As part of that career, I actually worked as a project manager and/or publishing producer for the U.S. Navy's training simulators. So all the training simulators that they use to learn how to drive ships, operate systems, work on equipment like the jet engine side of ships, stuff like that. So I got a chance to basically help build all those things, either by providing funding and tracking the scheduling of the milestones, and then actually making sure that what we would call a studio in this industry hit the milestones or not. But I got to work with some incredible people, and that was really the thing that drew me to the industry when I decided to depart that career. So I really wanted to work with such amazing people, but also wanted to build something really fun. And you always talk about this, like the magic of being a game developer is that you're actually like creating worlds for people to inhabit. And I just love that. And then of course, at first I wasn't exactly sure how to get in, but then I found IGA and the community and all the awesome people. And then that basically I was home.
Awesome. Yeah, you're glossing over a lot, but you are also a veteran as well, and spent a long time in the military. That was your first career. You decided to switch over here to games. Amazing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when I say my 20-year career I was actually a veteran, and I had the opportunity to work with a lot of amazing people. And so I just don't talk about it that way all the time because a lot of people are somewhat intimidated by it. But in reality, I'm a nice person.
Nick is like the sweetest person in the world. And you are now piloting the ship of your indie game company, but Nick literally piloted or captained ships in the past as well. So you've got experience. You've got applicable credentials here.
Yeah, a little different.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about board games. So give me like the suggestion of the title for today's episode. How you switched tactics, how you changed from doing video games to board games. There's reasoning here that you've now just explained. You had some basically prior game already built. It looked pretty promising, and that was a good enough reason to invest into it. But I'd love to hear a little bit more nuance to that story. Like, what is, in your mind, why is this an interesting topic at all? Why are we talking about building a board game? Why is that a choice?
Yeah, this is a bit of a longer answer. So I just want to preface this by saying I know I'm going to be talking quite a bit here, but I want to walk walk you through my entire mindset and the process by which I developed this idea and why the board game route made so much sense. So I'll talk about some personal thoughts about how to start a game studio, basically talking about the most important assets that a studio has. I will kind of identify some serious questions that someone has to ask if they're going to start a game studio, and then the steps that we are personally taking to meet that strategy. So basically the way we answer those questions. So the first thing is, if you're starting a brand new game studio and you're developing your first game, to be frank, it's a lost proposition until you actually get a product on the market.
Yeah.
Or you secure funding in some way, right? Some kind of either angel investor or publishers or VC. Those funding options all have, dangers to them. For example, with investors, you might lose your equity or you might lose your intellectual property. That's especially common with publishers today. And basically, that's a bad thing because developers have these incredible products they want to build, and then they want the players to experience, but they have to actually get it to market. So the first question you have to ask is like, how do I stop the hemorrhaging of all this revenue, all this money, so I can run the business, but also get a game to market? And that's the first question that we had to answer. The second question is, once you actually finish the game, is how do you distinguish yourself in that market? So right now, there's at least 40 games appearing on Steam every single day, and there's definitely more on mobile. And I'm not even talking about the other distribution platforms. And so it's really difficult to distinguish yourself with something new. So the answers that we came up with basically led to our epiphany that the two most important things for any game studio are your people and then your intellectual property. And so I've started to think more of games as basically one of the vehicles by which people interact with your intellectual property. So if you start thinking of it this way, it starts becoming like, this is going to start of the mind shift as to why this is a good idea. Okay, so now we have to start thinking about like, what are the new questions that this kind of brings up? The first one is, I think I've already said it, but it's how do you stop the hemorrhaging of the money? How do you actually get your product to market? So some answers we initially came up with were, do you build smaller, faster games? The danger there is that maybe that'll water down our future offerings. Does it give us legitimacy in a crowded market? Some companies do this really well, but we decided that we probably wouldn't be able to. We talked about we tried to figure out if we want to try to get publisher investment. However, there's a couple of reasons we decided not to go that way. One of them was potential loss of IP, definitely the loss of revenue in the future. And then we were also concerned that the studios were becoming very beholden to the publishers, and publishers, as we have seen recently, will just turn off a project and then you can't finish it. So the next question was, in the crowded market, how do you create the necessary quality, IP recognition, and legitimacy that makes you stand out amongst all those other games? And so we figured out that we had to somehow demonstrate a high quality product relatively rapidly with an interesting IP, and then show that we are actually like a real business able to produce what we say we can. And then finally, is how do you break away from this idea that you're chasing a hit? And so what we decided is we want to start a little slower, develop some runway, get this credibility out there, and then grow our IP. So basically, our answer to all those questions was, well, let's start with a board game. Because we had something close. We had an IP that was very promising and it would not cost as much time to develop that IP into something that we were very proud of. And then, that's basically why we think this is a good option for some game studios who are trying to find ways to approach the market a little differently.
Okay, now this is interesting. We're gonna do another interview. Nick, we're gonna do another interview in like 6 months after you've done distribution, after you've gotten your board game published and sent it out to a bunch of people. Because for me, at least, and for my team when we did Tailmore, that was one of the biggest challenges. Like making a cool game, it was great, it was fun, and then once we were actually sending out those boxes, it was a whole heck of a lot of work. So that doesn't mean, I'm not saying that to diminish the suggestion at all. I think it's a really interesting one. What is it about when you say this could be a good start for game companies? It helps differentiate yourself a little bit. Self-publishing means you get to keep your IP. The board game can be the beginning of your IP. And by the way, that's proven effective in so many different contexts. There's a bunch of really wonderful stories from past big IP these days that started, somewhere small. Miyazaki, all of his films, very famous anime movies, started in comic books. Actually, same deal with Dragon Ball Z. Dragon Ball Z started as like a little comic book that built up into something else. Warhammer 40K started as a magazine that just like released game, concepts in there. So starting as something else and building IP over time is proven to work. It's just, of course, it doesn't work in all contexts. So here's my long-winded question. Are you specifically saying board games? That's where you should start. Or are you saying it could just be something other than video games? Is it a broader answer?
So going back to my epiphany that games are a vehicle for players to experience or interact with your intellectual property, perhaps what I'm recommending is that there might be a strategy that does not involve starting with a board game to get your IP out there. And then by developing that IP and getting players interacting with it, they'll get them excited about when you do publish a board game in the future. I'm sorry, a video game in the future. It just happens for us, the answer was a board game. But yeah, I think for other people, it could be comic books, it could be fiction books, it could be a blog on the internet. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. But basically, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that we don't have to, as video game developers, we don't have to just think of the only options to get a game on the market is bootstrap, publisher investment, right? There's something else out there, and we're just trying to figure out what those are. I'm not successful yet, so I don't know if it's going to work, but I think it will.
I mean, yeah, there's proven evidence that it works, at least to some degree, and it's definitely an interesting suggestion. Building up an audience and building up a followership for your IP is absolutely a marketing channel at the very least, and hopefully sort of an enrichment channel as well. It makes your game feel fuller, deeper. Like, oh man, I really enjoyed playing this game. And also, there's a 10 series webcomic I can go read about the main character. Like, hell yeah. That's really cool. Now, I haven't actually said this yet, and I'm kicking myself because I should have mentioned it at the beginning. You have a Kickstarter live right now. Isn't that true?
So it's actually, we're in the pre-launch phase. We will go live October 1st at 10 a.m. Eastern time. That is Void Pilot's Legacy on Kickstarter. I will paste the link in chat actually really fast if anybody wants to check it out.
Yes.
We currently have, I believe it is... 1,711 followers. So that's pretty exciting. I love that. I love seeing that. And so, oops, that's the wrong one. Sorry. I do want to link to that article as well later. Yeah, we're going to talk BattleTech in a second. So yeah, so we are really excited about this, and our Kickstarter is coming very soon. So we're really excited about it. Please follow us if you're interested in what we're doing.
Yeah. If you want to learn from Nick, if you want to just play a really cool game, if you want to get your hands on it, if you want to support Nick, your fellow indie dev, follow that friggin' Kickstarter right now. If you're listening after the fact, there's links to join down below. All right. Now, I want to go back to the conversation of building an IP ahead of time. So what I'm hearing from you, I believe, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the biggest problems for launching indie games is one, funding, yes. But two, it feels like the bigger question you're answering is discoverability, is standing out from those, 62 is the stat I heard, actually, Steam games a day, which is crazy. There's 1 million games in the App Store, they're like literally. So just standing out as an indie is really hard. And what I hear a lot of the time from indie devs is, I don't have the team that I need to build X, Y, or Z. I can't get started with this game for X, Y, or Z reason. Oftentimes it's, I don't have the money, I don't have the team, I don't have the support I need. But I think what you're largely suggesting is, well, then don't start with a game. Start with something else. What is within your control? If you're a narrative designer or a writer, you can start writing stories about this world right now, and that's actually essentially production time leading up to an eventual game. But also is potential validity for you to pull together a team as you go. It's also a longer period of time in which you can be a little bit more relaxed about it, in which you don't necessarily need funding right away. But it doesn't have to be stories either. It can be a webcomic. It can be, it can be a board game in this case. It can be basically anything that starts to create some identity for that IP. And then I think importantly, starts to build a following or an audience for that IP. Because truly, like, those are the people who buy your game. It's not randos on the internet for the most part. Does that sound about right? Yeah.
What you just said is perfect. That's literally the way that I think now. Yeah, I think that's 100% accurate. And so, when you think about some of the recent indie games that have done really well, a lot of them, it's the art style is really fantastic, or the story they're telling is really fantastic. And those link back to the intellectual property. I think that if you don't have a strong intellectual property, or at least if you haven't defined your intellectual property or found the things that make it stand out, I think it's unfortunately likely that the barrier to entry for your product will be higher than what you'd like.
What are some, this is a pretty cool like mindset. I'm always a fan of reducing the load to get started, because people mentally make way bigger of a load than is actually true and stop themselves before ever starting because they're worried about that load. So I love this as a way to reduce how much effort it takes to get started. Quick question. What are some alternatives? Like, what are some other ways you could potentially start building that IP? We got webcomics, board games, maybe like short stories. What else might there be?
Oh, I hope that chat has some great answers because
Yes, please tell us, chat.
Yeah, because clearly board games is my primary answer.
Yeah. If we have any others, drop them in chat. What else can you start with besides board games, webcomics, short stories? I feel like you could also maybe start with like actual animations if that's within your capability. Little series. You can have like depending on what the IP is, you can have other smaller versions. Like you could do short form videos, maybe if it's some kind of like educational IP, maybe. Personal social media.
Even YouTube content, I guess, telling stories.
Live action skits, says Rick. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, yeah.
Live action skits are great because that's like, I can imagine just you and a couple of buddies like being void pilots.
I like Victor's answer. Start with a show on Netflix.
Yeah, you got that easy.
I would love to get to Netflix. That's always an answer.
Yep. Paper crafts. That's so cute. Yeah, paper crafts and merchandise. Absolutely. Start with just like cute little guys.
Yeah, and it's not like, and there's other people who I've seen. So, some streamers have started as streamers, and then as they develop their audience, then they shift into game development. So that's also an option if you are good with content creation or being on camera, and you're very comfortable with that kind of environment.
Yeah, I mean, freaking Video Game Donkey started a publishing house, and they're actually doing quite well.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Nick, it sounds like you've got a little bit more you're ready to teach us. So where do you want to go next with this?
Yeah, so I think I would like to start by showing you that when you kind of already named some of the examples I love to bring up, like Warhammer 40K, especially with Games Workshop. I think that's a great example. It always makes me laugh because despite the fact I look very young, I was actually a child of the 80s. And so one of the ones I wanted to bring up specifically was BattleTech. So this is the Polygon article they released about the birth of BattleTech just recently. And the reason I want to bring this up is because BattleTech was created by two friends back in the 80s. I think it was 1980s when they started their company for only $350, which is about $1,200 today. Basically the cost of the business admin, right? And by 1984, they had developed this game called Battle Droids, which was made with basically cardboard glued together on a little map. And they had little cool mechs that they were using to fight each other. And they took that to a major convention. And then before you knew it, that became, the second edition became BattleTech. Now, the reason I think this is super important is because BattleTech is, you may not be familiar with it. First of all, it's a fantastic board game. It's a board game where you take miniatures and you fight little armies with each other, but it's got a lot of lore. It had, back in the 90s, it was a serious, that must have been 15 to 20 books, multiple series. They also had video games come out, which now I think they're up to MechWarrior 5. And then if you were old enough, you may remember they even had pre-VR arcade battle pods. You would go to special malls in America, climb inside a battle pod and be able to fight in a networked environment against other people inside of battle pods. And it blew my mind back then. But what's cool is in 2001, FASA stopped selling BattleTech games and transitioned completely to an IP licensing company. And they licensed or sold the IP for BattleTech, the board game, to end up under Topps hands, and now it's being republished under Catalyst, who licensed it from Topps. And the video game rights are actually owned by Microsoft Gaming. And FASA still exists today as a licensing company, and now they're also bringing back some of their other IPs, like Shadowrun. So basically, the reason I'm bringing this up is this model that we're discussing today is not unheard of. It's just one that I think some people don't like look back on models and say, oh, that one actually might work today. And so that's part of why this was such an interesting idea when we were coming up with our own strategy.
Yeah. There's this. So we've just recently launched the Indie Game Foundry, which is an educational incubator that we're going to be starting in January. And the whole concept there is to take people through literally starting their company. So actually founding a company, leaving with an LLC and ownership of that business, as well as launching their first game. And we did a bunch of research to, put together this program. And one of the really simple things we found is how much money indie game companies tend to make compared to how many games they have released together. And the very first game, on average, from a new indie company makes only $300, which is not a lot of money if you didn't know. It's something. Hey, be proud of it. Absolutely, every dollar counts. But my point to bring this up is it's a really interesting mindset that I think like resilient indie companies have, which is they know that this probably won't be a slam dunk hit. And they know that probably at best they're going to break even. Maybe they're going to make a couple of dollars for this first game, these first two games. But they also know, I think those that tend to succeed are also sort of building themselves a bedrock to continue to create upon. And they understand, if I remember that chart correctly, it's like the third or fourth game that breaks $100,000, which is when we're starting to get a little bit more serious there, right? So they know that, yeah, it might take 3 or 4 games, but then again, hey, it only takes 4 games. So I think what you're also talking about is a little bit more of like a patient, resilient mindset. Like, I'm not really expecting to have a Stardew Valley success from my board game, but what I am expecting is I'm going to stand out a little bit, show that I have something different, show that I have an interesting IP and a realistic company, viable company, somebody who actually can deliver this game, and that way I'm going to make that second or third game more likely to succeed.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And actually, the other thing I love about Foundry is the fact that the studios keep their IP, which when you compare that to other publishers that take the IP or end up owning a large chunk of the IP, that's super critical because they can create sequels later on without never having to give back to Foundry. It's their IP forever. So that's super important.
Yeah. So what is the... keep going. No.
Oh, no, I was gonna say the other fun part about this discussion is crowdfunding. And that's always the question is like, why would you go for crowdfunding when you're trying to start this board game? And I'll tell you that. And by the way, crowdfunding is not easy. With Tailmore already that you end up spending about as much as what you get back from the crowdfunding. But what crowdfunding did do for us, and the reason we decided to go this route is because, first of all, our game is highly niched, like very much so. It is if you don't already know about Void Pilot's Legacy, it is a ultra portable, solitaire science fiction board game played with cards and dice. And in the game, you basically are a void pilot who's operating on the frontier of the Empire. And so you are commanding a ship, leading your very loyal crew, and you're executing dangerous missions and exciting combat to earn your legacy. We have a cool heroism mechanic where you sacrifice your crew members and your hull points on your ship in these crazy moments of the game to basically ensure you don't fail. But it's a pretty wild ride. But because it's so niched down, we decided that this is a great market test for us. So we're trying to figure out, is this the right thing for us? Is this the right IP that we want to pursue? Because the IP we've selected is the one that, if this works, is the one we're going to use for all of our games. Will we be able to get market penetration? And in such a highly niched market, it's the barrier to entry is a little bit lower. And then the Kickstarter process actually allows us to see if people are excited about it because A, you're marketing to them, but B, they're actually putting money down. And so it's a lot easier than asking my mom, who loves us both, says things like, yes, the game you make will definitely make money. But it's much different when the Kickstarter shows that we've been able to fund to 100% hopefully in a rapid period of time. And then we'll actually have like a real market. So basically crowdfunding is a great market test and will allow us give us the proof that we need to continue with the project.
Yeah, really interesting to even use Kickstarter as a proof of concept. That alone is something people don't really think about with Kickstarter. I urge, by the way, I'm gonna spend 1 second. I'm gonna ask you another question, and then we're gonna go to comment questions. I urge everyone to be. Yes, we want to get to that third or fourth game that makes millions and billions of dollars, but I really do urge everyone to be satisfied with those base hits. Tailmore, for example, I'll be very transparent. We spent about $30,000 in total to build Tailmore. That included hiring people to make the art, hiring writers. That included paying for marketing for Kickstarter. That included paying for basically Kickstarter consultants. We spent $30K between 3 founders, $10,000 each, to get this game out there. We made from Kickstarter $30,000. We broke even. And the nice thing about that is that then we were able to sell the game. And, so we've kind of made a couple $1,000s in profit. And we definitely got the game out there, which is actually, as far as it goes, that actually is above the curve. Most board games Kickstarters fail. So the reason that I mentioned all this is so that you understand the numbers and are satisfied with those numbers. It is okay to just break even. It is okay to just make a couple of bucks. All of that is progress forward. I think the biggest thing is having that mindset for that second or third game. Being a little bit dissatisfied, being okay, being proud, but being a little bit dissatisfied with those numbers and pushing for the future. Here's the big question I want to ask before we move on. We've talked a lot about basically the value of setting up IP ahead of time and using that IP as a strength for future games, as a potential multiplying factor for future games. How do I know if it's the right IP? How do I identify a good IP? What even is a good IP? Tell me, Nick.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So I have my own answers to this. This is not the book answer for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I will say that IP, a solid IP is something that gets your fan base excited and they want to interact with it.
Yeah.
You would know that you have a good IP if they want to interact it, not just with the products you provide, but ones that they start creating on their own. So fan generated content, I think, is a really good indicator.
Yes.
Or things like if you have the ability to generate fiction or blogs or things like that, where people can continue to interact with the game after the game is over, or they're excited about the next game coming along. Yeah, so when we explore the IP that we are developing, so it's called the Chronicles of the Stellar Drive Empire.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big things we did was we've definitely spent a lot of time reworking it so that it makes a lot more sense. It's meant to be a very realistic IP that makes sense. It's set in the future. Clearly, it's in space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, but very character driven. So the stories that come out of it are very exciting. And I'll tell you my secret for it is I don't know if anyone knows about this book, but if you study political science at all, there's a very famous book called The Landmark Thucydides. It's thousands of years old and talks about the war between Athens and Sparta. And basically, when you talk about the international relations today, we still refer back to this book. And so it's a great book about how humans actually interact. And it's been accurate basically forever. So I have pulled out my copy and we've applied the lessons that we've learned from that against our own IP so that it actually makes sense. One thing I never want to do is have an IP that just made zero sense and people were always like, why is that happening? That makes no sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love so there's we talk a lot about actually in IGA3 about identifying whether or not you have a promising game concept. And that is related, but not exactly the same as a promising IP. An IP is something grander, actually, than a promising game concept. With game concepts, any kind of user engagement is really big. So I had a personal example that I love sharing, where in college I was working on this little puzzle game, and I was having my roommates play it. And then I had to go to class. It was like a 2-hour class, and I came back, and one of them was still playing it. So that's a great example of the unexpected delight that you're finding in your users. Any art, like you talked about, any fan art or just fan creations is huge. And I think that is more uniquely for IPs than it is for games. If people love what you're building so much that they want to be a part of it and are creating for it, that's huge. That's really good signs. Even one piece of fan art is nice. Okay, sweet. We're starting to build some kind of traction, some kind of understanding that this is cool. And then for that matter, people wanting to work with you, not just in fan art capacities, but in more professional capacities. Hey, can I contribute to this in any way? Is also really good sign. That means that they are excited and want to give of themselves to make that thing, function. All right, it is time for. Yes. Do you want to respond to that at all?
No, actually, that's without giving away too much. I will say that we've had those exact indications, and so that's what has propelled us to this point, and why we're so excited about what we're bringing to the market.
Yes, I love that. And there's so many good books about this, by the way. I'm currently finally rereading, I guess, The Art of Game Design. I read it so long ago, though, and he talks a lot about picking that initial theme that has emotional connectivity to it. So, for instance, of what you described to me of Void Pilot's Legacy, the main thing that resonated with me is you're alone on the frontier of space. Like that immediately, like, ooh, I can feel that in my guts, you know? All right, we're going to jump into community questions. Maka does not have a microphone, so I'm going to read this first question for them. Here it is, Nick. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Are there any unique challenges to either board or digital game creation that don't exist for the other type of game?
Oh yeah. So actually, I would say that the most unique challenges are on the physical side is actually developing the logistics train. So you have to have a manufacturer to fulfillment to last mile delivery. And so developing that logistics train from the manufacturer to the customer is actually the most complicated part, which is not at all in video games. Distribution is basically handled for you by basically big companies that have provided you the entire service. All you got to do is upload everything, which is super easy. I will say that we actually have a full chain already developed. So our game is being manufactured by Longpack Games in China, and then we have shipping to the United States, and then it'll be fulfilled by Quartermaster Logistics, who's industry standard fulfillment for the games industry, and especially with crowdfunding. And then afterwards, we'll shift to a more standard fulfillment system so we can get it in retail.
Awesome. Yeah, I have found the exact same thing. It is the fact that it is a physical object and everything that implies. So getting proof of concept, for instance, like getting a prototype even is so much harder with a board game. I mean, obviously a like paper prototype where you are creating the pieces yourself is actually easier in board games, but then getting like a hard copy that shows you what the final production box will look like is actually a lot harder than you expect. That takes a ton of time. And then I think one of the biggest ones is iteration post-release is essentially impossible for anything physical. Versus a video game, you can push your build and then like 3 minutes later be like, oh no, there was a big game-breaking bug, and you can immediately fix it. Versus a board game, I mean, the combat balancing in Tailmore is still atrocious to this day because there's no fixing it. All right.
So one of the things, actually, if you'll allow me, if you're watching this in real life, you'll get this, or real time, you'll see this. But whoops, that's the wrong one. But we actually have a prototype here on my desk right now that shows our entire prototype, as well as some of the upgrade stuff that we're going to have, including holographic cards, special dice. So actually, you're the first person to see this.
So cool.
But yeah, so we've actually been using physical prototypes for the game for the last 2 or 3 months. So we wanted to make sure that the logistics or the manufacturing even existed that could get us the product we wanted. Otherwise, we weren't even going to try with this.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how much more work there actually is there. Because like even just trying to find out if a shape of a piece is doable can be challenging. Because there's stuff, there's like meeples that people can just produce en masse, and there's no problem with getting that from a game producer, somebody who actually, or what is the right word? Somebody who manufactures, that's it, the board game. But then if you want anything custom, you're talking about getting like a die cast mold of your piece built, which is thousands of dollars. All right, Slytacular, I've just had you sitting on stage awkwardly while we discuss this. Would you like to ask the second question?
Sure. Hey, Nick, how does working on a board game help explore world building and game mechanics for your eventual future video game? ?
Yeah, first of all, that's a great question. Sly and I are actually both out of Jacksonville. We're both in the local IGDA down here, so it's pretty awesome that you're here.
Awesome.
So thanks for being here. So I would say that so part of the fun way of like introducing players to the IP is how do you do it, right? Some people like to throw people in like right at the very beginning. If you recall the moment when you entered the theater and saw Star Wars for the very first time and the Corellian Corvette comes flying over your head, followed by the Star Destroyer.
So cool.
That was a pretty blatant introduction to the whole universe all at once, right? With this board game, because you're on the frontiers of the Empire, we're basically kind of like starting you with like understanding, yeah, we're in space. Here's a couple things about the Empire. Hey, the Authority are a bunch of jerks. Hey, there's pirates out here. And just kind of giving you a sense of what's kind of there as like a promise for what's going to come next. And then we've been developing a lot more additional IP because we do actually have 2 more board games in the pipe already. And so we want to make sure that all kind of works together. So by the 3rd board game, you're basically strategically helping the Empire or not.
Gotcha.
Does that answer your
I hope
question?
that answers the question.
Yeah. I was just like, I was just kind of wondering, like as you're like working on like the board game mechanics, like are there specific things about that you're like thinking like, oh, this is going to translate well into like the game I'm making, or like whatever project I'm working in the future with this. Like how is this going to, like how is working on this solo game or something kind of help like eventually work its way into like the franchise, like what are some things that you kind of see passing on to the next thing, like what are some of the thought processes and things. I don't know if I'm saying this in a very interpretable way.
You're doing great.
Yeah, no, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And that's basically what we did. And so we do have as part of we actually have our own lore book that we have internally. And so we've identified very specific things that have to make sense across all the games. And so some of those things we tested and then modified based on how the game played. And then that is going to feed into the future games that we develop as well as the video games. It's hard to explain what they are without telling you what the lore book says, but I don't want to do that right now.
Gotcha. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sly. Fantastic. We've got a question from Quilty. Let me find it again. Let's see here. Sorry. Where'd it go? All right, we're going to ask Haley's question, and then we'll do Quilty next, because I can't actually find Quilty's question. Haley, I'm going to pull you on stage, because I'm just assuming that you want to be here.
Haley's coming on the stage. Haley's coming on the stage.
Yeah, no, we're doomed. Wait, where's Haley's face?
Yep, right there in the middle, at least on my screen. Second row.
Second.
I'm not sure if it's the
Why
same
am I
on
having such a hard
yours.
time finding? Did you change your thing? Am I crazy?
Haley has like a little hand.
I found it.
Right.
Thank you. Oh, you're so quiet. Yes, it's quiet, but you know, it's here. I'll turn you up.
Wait, okay. I'm sorry. My question was like, when building your first few games, if they're only statistically slated to like not make much money, like how do you maximize your success chances?
Oh, just in general.
Yeah.
So luckily these are not our first games. I built games with the IGA program, and I would say that the very first game definitely made about the exact amount or just under what Willem thought that it would, which makes total sense. And then by starting with board games and then rolling into future games, we're hoping that we can accelerate the trend a little bit. And then and part of that is the crowdfunding, using crowdfunding to prove that we have a market for the games that we're developing, if that makes sense. So basically, this is very much the producer mindset, by the way, like testing and then iterating on something very quickly. And so we know that if this game fails, then we would move to the next game, make some changes, and then push forward with that as well. And so we would be able to more rapidly figure out where we failed at and then move forward. To be frank with you, I don't think we're going to fail. So far, all of our projections look fantastic for Void Pilot's Legacy. The number of followers we have has really demonstrated the desire for the audience to interact with the game and the IP. And then we're also getting a lot of, like I said before, some other really positive signs. And so I'm very excited about this launch. Does that answer the question?
Awesome. Thank you, Haley. Yeah, I will echo that. It's looking great, Nick. You guys are doing fantastic. Your follower count and the growth rate of the follower count is looking really good, especially for how much it looks like you're asking for. I will sort of second that. I think in that book that I'm rereading, actually, there's that quote that I use all the time: your first 10 games are going to suck. The way that you make your next games better is you pay attention to how to do so. It's really easy to just keep releasing games. And if the intention is just that this is a hobby, that's totally fine, by the way. And sometimes it's also totally fine to release a game or two where you're like, this is just for fun. That's totally cool. But if you are trying to make money from your games, if you are trying to build up an IP, if you are trying to build up a business, I think the biggest thing is release multiple games, be okay with them not making as much money as you expected, but learn from every single one. How can this next one be better every time? And sort of like, there's the whole like plan for failure, but hope for success mindset, I think that helps as well when we're talking about actual money in the door. Can your company survive if your game totally fails? It needs to be able to be totally frank. And then if it doesn't fail, you'll be like, great, now we have extra money. Wow. All right. Quilty, we got Quilty up on stage. It was an odyssey, but we're here. Quilty, would you like to ask your question about IP? Also, welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here and answering our questions, Nick.
Heck yeah.
So I just wanted to, earlier you were speaking sort of more orbital view about your background and your history and how you came to be making this board game. And you were talking about sort of interesting IP and how important that is, and how important developing that is. And I just wanted to nail down sort of how you went about building that, what some important milestones were, how developed was the idea when your brother came to you with it versus where did it kind of go from there, and how that process sort of looks, because you've talked a lot about IP generation, but you haven't we haven't really nailed down what that means. Does that mean really graphic design stuff? Does that mean going to a marketing team and testing a thing out and then shifting it? Can you just speak on that? I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So the IP, I would say, when it was first brought to the company, so when my brother first introduced it to me, was it just needed a little work. Basically, it was just enough design to make the game make sense. And so when we were discussing it, so he and I had our normal creative calls. We found ourselves getting really excited about it, and then trying to figure out how things would fit together. And so this is when we cracked open Thucydides, which is hilarious when you talk about that outside of a work context. It's a really dry book. And then and then we started kind of working our way through it. We started asking each other questions okay, so why is there an empire? So I'll tell you a little bit about the background. I can only talk a little bit about it, but basically, think just shortly in the future, there's a moonshot attempt by several companies and governments on Earth trying to figure out how do we get to space before we lose the ability to live on this planet. That moonshot succeeds. We get a starcraft that works. But then what happens, right? So this is what kind of where we started. This is the mental space in which we started. And so we started asking each other questions. All right, so what happens in 100 years? What happens in 200 years? Where does humanity go? Why did they go to this location? Have you ever considered how the galaxy is laid out? And this is just a fun discussion, but when you look at the galaxy, it's a three-dimensional space and it's disc-shaped. So most people, when they think about it, think of it in a two-dimensional way. So you think of it standard XY axis. The problem is that it's got depth. And so when people think about stars that they're seeing on the map, it actually, you can't just travel, the XY dimensions are not always the closest. Oftentimes it's actually the depth that's the closest. And so we actually looked at real star charts out to, I think it was 50 light years, and we actually identified places where it would make sense for humanity to go if they were actually trying to escape this area for resources,
right,
and also for relative closeness. And so
right, and how does a society like that number stars? Because they're not just going to be doing them by name; they're going to be doing them by coordinate. And then, what system do you actually have to use? How many variables does that have? And yeah. Sorry, you've accidentally hit on a huge nerd of mine. We have a lot in common.
Yeah, no, this is great. And so we actually started working through that, and based on these discussions, the reason the empire comes into existence makes sense. I don't want to go past that point right now. But what we're trying to avoid is the classic sci-fi problem, which is the sci-fi trope. There's an empire, and it's evil.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Yeah. But the truth is that empires exist for a reason. There are socio-economic reasons that they exist, and so ours follows that path, and so it makes sense. And the friction that occurs throughout the empire makes sense in the context of humanity and how we've acted over the last several thousand years. And so I think that when you're playing in this universe, it'll make sense, and the character stories that come about because of that all make sense. So that's basically where we're heading. Does that kind of answer your question?
Oh, totally. And it's awesome to see how excited you are about your own work. So thanks so much.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Quilty, for the question.
I
It's a
feel
good
like
one.
that's boring stuff too. That's the crazy thing. That's all like the work behind it. But
No, that's the
the
cool
stories are
stuff.
what's fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this may be something we should have done earlier in the episode. For anyone who doesn't know, IP means intellectual property. And it is it's actually an extremely broad term. It's anything that you can put IP protections on. So it actually could include like an invention, or it could include I think trademark, I guess, would be considered like IP. For in the games world and in the entertainment world, when we say IP, we typically mean some kind of franchise or world or story. So Marvel is an IP, Dragon Ball Z is an IP, Pokemon is an IP. So typically, when you are talking about creating an IP, you're talking about coming up with a world, a unique story that multiple games, stories, products can fit inside. That's an IP. All right, we have time for one or two more questions. Before then, though, we're going to do our community question. I'm going to ask a very simple one, and if you don't get this, I'm going to be upset. The first person to type the correct answer to the following question in the chat will get 3 House Cup points. And if you're listening, speak the answer out loud for us. Here's the question. What is Nick's thesis for this entire episode? What might you do differently than just releasing your first game? Type it in the chat for us. I'm seeing lots of establish your IP. I need a little bit more than that, Rick, although that is pretty much it. Be handsome. All right, Sly, thanks for that one. There we go. I'm going to give it to Nuraven, I think. Start with building your IP through a different medium. Yeah, think about your IP as a long-lived entity rather than a single game. Mostly IPs come about because a single game blew up, and so they kind of turn it into an IP. I think what Nick is really suggesting is turning that formula around to start with the IP and then happen to fit a game into it. Love it. Nuraven, let us know which house you want to give those points to. All right, Rick, we're going to get you for probably the last House Cup question. We might do one more, depending on how fast this one is. Go ahead.
All right, so you decided to build a board game, but you are a video game developer. So you know how important it is to go through the playtesting cycle and get feedback from your players. What does the feedback cycle look like with your board game? Where do you go for it, and what kind of feedback do you want from it? How does it differ?
Yeah, so that's a great question. How does it differ? It doesn't really change that much. The major difference is that we probably couldn't get as varied a number as we could with a video game. And so let me explain that. So a lot of times you can do a play test through a distribution platform, for example, Steam or Apple App Flight, or there's all kinds of different ways to do it. But basically, Test Flight for Apple. And basically, it's an automated system that allows you to take early builds and publish them out to users that you authorize, and then you get results back with everything from crash data to a questionnaire afterwards to just like all kinds of stuff that you can get from from a digital game. From a physical game, you have to actually go somewhere or deliver a copy of the game. And so we were limited by the number of prototypes that we had and the and ourselves, like being places we went to. So we got our play tests mostly we had a pool of play testers that we basically contracted to help us with. We also went to our FLGS, our favorite local game stores, to get play testers. I had the opportunity to play test a couple times with IGDA. And then we do have a tabletop simulator version of the game, which oftentimes is released to allow people to play test. But we did find one of the mechanics does not really go very well with the way that tabletop simulator is designed. Basically, there's a rotation mechanic in how you hold the cards in your hand. And with tabletop simulator, the way that it handles decks, it doesn't like that. And so we actually found it to be super unfun. And so we made the decision to not test on tabletop simulator because it, I think, would have negatively affected the view of the game without someone actually trying it. Everyone who's actually played the game really enjoys the mechanic. Tabletop simulator, it's super horrible because the system just hates it. So I don't know if I answered your question, but basically it's the same. It's just that you're limited by physical proximity and physical copies.
Yeah, that does mostly answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, that's interesting. I would have, if I answered that question myself, the first thing I would have said was Tabletop Simulator, because for Tailmore, the vast majority of our playtesting was Tabletop Simulator. That's how we got literally probably 95% of our playtests in. We tried to make sure, though, that we were doing some physical playtests, but at the same time, like you're saying, it's so much harder to set up. I think your game as a solitary game was probably a little bit easier. For us, you really need like an adventuring party to really have a good time. So you need 4 or 5 or 6 people. So it was really hard to ever coordinate that in person. So we did so much of our testing through Tabletop Simulator and accepted that it was a strictly worse experience. But we figured, and I think this mostly was proven to be true, that even if it was a worse experience, if they're enjoying the worse experience, then they'll love the better experience later.
Yeah, that's a great point. I will say that as a solo game, it is much closer to a video game. And so the process is actually very similar. You basically set it up for the player and then you don't say anything.
Yeah.
So very similar to a video game.
Yeah, 100%. The actual process of playtesting did not change for us. Something else to actually throw out here maybe is demos and downloadable PDFs. So we had the Tabletop Simulator that we would run when we were running playtesting, but for people that try it on their own and then send us feedback, we had a downloadable demo that printed out just enough pieces that you could cut out just from paper and like tape together to play a single short scenario and then send us feedback. And we didn't get a ton of people doing that. I think that was a high lift, but we did get some good play testing from that. So yeah, that's maybe something else to consider. All right, It is 12:58, so I think we're going to call that our final question of the day. Thank you, everyone, with all of your wonderful questions. Nick is around and, of course, is on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out, Nicholas Gurley. And, of course, follow Void Pilot's Legacy. I'm going to say that again before the end of the episode. Before then, though, Nick, we always like to give a homework assignment here. So what is something that the audience can do in the next week that'll take them about an hour to practice some of what we've learned here today?
Yeah, so I actually would recommend that you have 3 questions to answer. So first one is for, well, basically everybody. So I know that game developers love developing their games, but let's talk business. What is your strategy for funding the development of your game? What are the pros and cons of each funding option for your particular situation? 2 is consider your IP. Can you develop your IP further? What makes it valuable and how can you capitalize on it? And then 3, what's the strategy for your studio once you finish your first game? So specifically consider everybody who's involved in the game process, so your team, how do you keep them employed and how do you keep earning money after that first game?
That's awesome. Those are a couple of questions that I find juniors and those just founding for the first time don't answer. So these are really strong questions. So I'm going to contextualize this to make it easier for people to post this to LinkedIn, because we'd love to see that. We'd love to see you actually do your homework. So tell me if this sounds about right, Nick. We want you to write up 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph about your funding strategy, how you're actually going to fund this thing. The second one about why your IP. What is it about your IP that makes it strong? Why are you investing in this IP? And then number 3, what is your plan post game 1? What is your plan post the beginning of your IP? Does that sound right?
Yep, perfect.
Cool.
That sounds perfect.
Awesome. And if you aren't working on a game right now, so you don't have something to like base this upon, come up with an IP. Do it just as a practice exercise. Post it to LinkedIn for us. You can tag the Indie Game Academy. You can tag Nicholas Gurley. We'll be all excited for you. Maybe give you some feedback. And then if LinkedIn is too much, if that's intimidating, you can also post it here in our Discord. Once again, there's links to join down below. All right, Nick, it is time to say goodbye. Any last words of wisdom or anything you want to plug here at the very end?
No, but if you haven't already, please follow us on Kickstarter if you're excited about the project. And then, of course, please continue to be a part of this amazing community. I cannot tell you how much I love the IGA community. And it's not just because I work here. It's because I was a part of it a year before I started working here. And I've loved it every single day.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, Nick. We're trying hard. Yes, so I'm gonna push it even harder. Go follow Void Pilot's Legacy. If you're listening to this right now, please go follow it. Even if you can't back it, even if it's not quite your game, the follower count, similar to the Steam wishlist count, helps a lot with accessibility, as well as just the overall performance of that game. So follow the game for us. Do Nick a favor. Do me a favor. And then hopefully it's your kind of game and you actually buy the thing. But at the very least, get yourself that follow. All right, Nick, thank you so much for being here. This is a fun episode. Thank you for answering these questions. Heck yes. Thank you to those who asked questions and for those who are listening. And as always, if you enjoy this episode, we ask that you send it along to just one other person who may enjoy it too. And otherwise, we'll see you next week, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. There's links to join. I'll see you later.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone. And to those watching the stream, I got to hit the stop button. We'll see you again soon. Adios, people.